Good afternoon. My name is Yvonne Ortiz. I am the Training Institute Manager for the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and welcome to our webinar session today titled Using Story Circles to Capture Local Community Responses to Gender-Based Violence During TDVAM and Beyond. We are very excited to have you here, and we are really excited to have Amy Hill from StoryCenter joining us today. She is a great friend, and we enjoy her. Every time she presents, she, shares so much great information, so we are excited. So let's get started. Again, we are the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, and today we are hosting a webinar for one of our key initiatives and projects, is the Domestic Violence Awareness Project. We are a national technical assistance provider that shares information with organizations and individuals, incredible resources for those that want to learn more about domestic violence and its intersections. And through the Domestic Violence Awareness Project, we have been mobilizing people to commit to, to doing one thing in response to the problem of gender-based violence. And this has been our theme for this year. So we are very excited. And before we start at the NRCDV, we always try to remember everybody and remind ourselves too of what we stand for. So this is our NRCDV stance. I'm going to share with you. We stand with individuals and groups who have been targeted, degraded, marginalized because they are Native Americans, people of color, immigrants, women, Muslims, LGBTQ, or people with disabilities. We stand against white supremacy, racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and all other forms of structural oppression. We stand with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, especially those most vulnerable and with limited access to services and protection. We stand together in celebration of the rich diversity of people in this country and the vitality and strength they bring to our communities and society. We stand with those who embrace self-care and community connection as necessary and powerful for social change. We stand with other activists and organizations who continue to work passionately for gender, racial, and economic and social justice for all. So welcome, everybody. That is who we are, and that's how we guide our everything that we do, from materials that we develop, from training events that we create for all of you guys. So before we start, let me see, and I go on. I just wanted to remind everybody of our campaign. And as you know, in 2008, our Domestic Violence Awareness Project decided to expand on the Awareness plus Action equals Social Change campaign. And the group intentionally wanted to create a message that it was easy to say, easy to remember, and easy to personalize and adapt, and making it easier for the movement to get involved and feel connected. So today, Amy here will introduce a simple community-based process for sharing and capturing poignant personal stories of how everybody can take action. And one of the things that we encountered while working our campaign for Domestic Violence Awareness Month was that everybody had so many pictures, so many videos that they collected from, their community. And today we're just going to focus on what do we do now that I have all this information. What do I do with it? Well, let's use it throughout the year. Domestic violence awareness shouldn't be just, something that we do during October. We need to continue sending the message in our communities. And Amy is here with us today to help us. So let me just tell you a little bit about Amy, a good friend. Amy is a fourth-generation Californian with deep roots in Sonoma County. After spending 12 years coordinating women's health and violence prevention projects throughout California for the State Department of Health Services, Amy discovered digital storytelling and launched StoryCenter's Silence Speaks initiative, which since 2000 has used oral history, participatory media, and popular education strategies to support people in countries around the world as they share personal stories of gender, health, and human rights. She lives in Berkeley, where she continues to lead Silent Six and guide much of the agency's communication and outreach work. So welcome, Amy. We're so glad to have you.
Great. Let me just activate my video. Thank you so much, Yvonne. I'm really happy to be with the webinar today, and hopefully I can provide some useful techniques and tips and ideas for everyone related to storytelling around issues of domestic violence. So I'm not going to say anything more about who I am because Yvonne just gave me that lovely introduction. So I want to just jump right in to the content. And so, what we had planned for today is first for people that, first for people who are not familiar with our work at StoryCenter, I'll give just a bit of background about the organization. And then we'll look at the rationale for working with personal stories to address domestic violence and domestic violence prevention. And just to be clear, while our organization, StoryCenter, does a good bit of work with digital storytelling to support people in creating and sharing stories as videos, this webinar is really focused on oral storytelling. And because it's really difficult to, you can't really train people how to do video production in a webinar. But if the storytelling, digital storytelling format is something that you're interested in, of course there can be chances to follow up later about that. And then we'll spend really most of the webinar then looking at our story circle approach in terms of process and best practices for leading groups in sharing personal stories, and then also some simple tools and methods for documenting stories. And then finally, we should have some time at the end for questions and discussion. So that is our plan. So let's go ahead and, and then I did also want to just give a quick heads up that I'm going to share a digital story that does touch on issues of sexual violence, and so just wanted to invite everyone to take care around that. And that's coming right up here. So since I am going to be talking quite a bit during the webinar, I wanted to start by sharing a story by somebody other than me. So I'm going to bring up all these slides. And first, we are going to watch a story that was created in one of our workshops. So you have a couple of options for viewing it. You can either click on the link in the slide itself, which should take you to a new tab in your browser, and you can access the story there. Or you can click on the link down in the chat box. I just pasted it there, and you should be able to either copy it and paste it into a new tab in your browser, or just click on the link right there. So it's only about 2 minutes. So if everybody could please go ahead and just watch the story, then when you're finished, please feel free to comment with your immediate reactions in the chat box down in the lower left-hand corner of the screen there, so I know when I can continue, or at least it's on the left on my screen. So we'll take just a moment now to watch the story.
What I really like about clay is that it's so forgiving. You can sculpt it into anything, and if you mess up, you can let it dry and then remold it. I think that's why I'm so drawn to it. I kind of feel like that's what I'm doing with my life. I've learned to be patient and still with my thoughts. It's less frequent now, but I still think about you. The memory of you lingers like a ghost. We were at your family's party, having such a great time. We didn't want the night to end, So a couple of us decided to go back to your place and keep drinking. The next thing I knew, I was awake, hair dripping wet, and I was naked in your white tee. I left your bed feeling ashamed and violated. After it happened, I would say to myself, it's important to talk about it. But then I would deny it and think, how is it even possible for you to hold me up in the shower? I was blacked out. Did that make it okay for you to rape me? We had only been going out for a few months and had never been sexual before. My life was a mess after I walked away from you. I drank even harder to disconnect myself from all the rage I felt. I remember the first time I was moved by another artist's work. I only had $50 in my account and I knew I had to have it. When I finally quit drinking, I signed on for a free ceramics class. At first, I needed to fill the time, but now it's so much more than that. I'm not ashamed anymore. You are to blame, not me. You raped me. I know that I'm enough and that I am strong. I shape my life, not you.
All right. So I see a few people are typing some comments. Thank you very much for your comments on that powerful story. So I'm going to go ahead and continue just so we can make sure that we get through all of the content today. So that story was shared as part of a workshop with alumni who have been involved as peer educators with a violence prevention program at City College of San Francisco. And I think it's a great example to start with because it's really told from a position of strength, even though it touches on some very sensitive topics. And because the workshop was a good example of how to begin from the premise that stories, personal stories can be developed in ways that can be shared publicly. So now I'm going to just go on to the, and I do really appreciate the comments. And I'm going to go, if people have more questions about that story, we'll come to questions at the end, and I'm just going to move on. So just as a bit of background about StoryCenter, as you can see, we developed the original digital storytelling methodology way back in 1993, even though that term is currently used to describe a lot of different media making practices. For us, it refers to a participatory storytelling and media process that brings small groups of people together over several days to share and create as short videos, stories from their own lives. We have a really long history of training thousands of people and lots of different organizations all around the world, speaking many different languages. And then finally, just in terms of the kind of the core philosophy underlying our work, it's really built out of an impulse to democratize artistic and cultural practice, basically to displace the act of media production and storytelling from a kind of professionalized realm into a truly community-based realm so that everyday people can share and witness compelling stories. So that's who we are. Just a few, I'm sure that this, I'm sure most of you on the webinar could really come up with this next set of bullet points yourselves in terms of just the value of personal storytelling. But I wanted to just go over a few points for why stories can make such a difference in efforts to address domestic violence. So first, related to work at the individual and community level, research really does show that telling and listening to real people's real stories can increase self-esteem and well-being, particularly people's sense of self-efficacy or the belief that they have agency and can handle life challenges. And I've included a link here to some material on digital storytelling impacts from our website, and then also to a link to a New York Times article about some of the research on the value of specifically personal writing for health and happiness. And then secondly, from the public health world, the idea of health literacy is defined as the degree to which individuals have the capacity to obtain, process, and understand basic health information and services needed to make appropriate health decisions. And so clearly storytelling has the capacity to bring across important factual information along with that human interest perspective drawing upon emotions. And so in this way, stories can prompt reflection on the part of listeners, and this allows them to apply what they've heard to their own life situation. So it's a great education method. And then next, practices, story sharing and listening are also key practices in the popular education realm. So people might be familiar with the work of Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, who really believed that the development of critical consciousness, which is something he felt was key to taking action for social change, must begin with close examination of one's own direct experience and its position within unjust social, political, cultural environments. And so practices like personal storytelling can essentially function as a form of popular education by supporting people really in connecting the dots between their own lives and the larger social, cultural, historical, political structures in which their lives are unfolding. And as they make these connections, they bond with each other around a shared sense of purpose and can become mobilized to speak out for change. So this is the power of storytelling in groups. And then related, sharing and listening to stories have also been shown to build solidarity and help people bond across difference and spur their desire and involvement in change-making activities. And I think there's a link here to a research study from our work with grassroots soccer down in South Africa a few years ago. There's a link there in the slide which showed that participating in digital storytelling can mobilize young women to take part in community building and mobilization efforts. And then finally, those of you who've been involved in policy advocacy don't need any of the research that I'm pointing to here to know really that storytelling and personal testimony can have a huge influence on legislative decision-making and policy issues. So those are just a few bits of rationale to motivate you around storytelling. And so now let's look at what kinds of stories can be most compelling. So you don't have to be an anthropologist to realize that stories are universal. People everywhere tell them and listen to them in lots of unique ways in order to understand themselves, their communities, and the larger world. And so now that we've talked about rationale, let's look at the kinds of stories that can be especially valuable. So first, a story might be really culturally specific in terms of language, local references, and details, like the story that we just watched, for instance. But when that story addresses universal themes like compassion or vulnerability or coming of age, relationships, this really adds to its power. And so just as people everywhere tell and listen to stories, all people are also capable of experiencing the same basic human range of emotions and feelings: sadness, anger, courage, compassion. And so when a story addresses a universal theme, the likely emotional response of viewers can make them feel connected to the story and better able to make meaning from it. And this is in fact consistent with research in neuroscience about mirror neurons, which suggests that exposure to expressions of deep emotion fire off these corresponding neurons for people who are, listening to expressions of emotion and then enable us to feel empathy. So for all of you who work with survivors, this is what's happening when you're having an empathic response to somebody sharing their experience. Okay, so secondly, stories can really help create a sense of intimacy when they're told in first-person voice. And so the intimacy piece, dialogue spoken in the moment, close description of something that someone has gone through, all of these kind of first-person strategies can really help create intimacy and touch people in a way that third-person reporting or facts and figures just can't. And then next, the quality of honesty in a narrative story can play a big role in making the story compelling. So one element we've found is really key to this is whether or not a storyteller is willing and able to make themselves vulnerable. And so part of the power of the story circle approach, which we'll get to, is kind of creating a container for this to occur. And by contrast, when stories are overly exploitive or graphic, or when they sensationalize topics, or even when they're just a little too kind of slick and polished, these things tend to detract from that sense of honesty. And then finally, the last point here really refutes the idea that a story itself has to convey some type of message. So, if you think about how barraged people are everywhere with all types of messages, both from advertising, public service, et cetera, the beauty of a well-told story lies in its subtlety. So it might include important information, but it doesn't sound demanding or preachy or bossy. And so our perspective at StoryCenter is that when specific understandings or actions are hoped for as a result of watching or hearing a story, these meanings and actions can be encouraged in discussions and through training activities and through supplemental information shared alongside the story. And I think the hashtag, the one thing hashtag, is a great example, right? You don't necessarily have to talk about, we have this hashtag one thing in a story, but that's an accompanying piece that can help get the story out into the world. It doesn't have to be part of the art of the story itself. All right, so now I want to turn to one of our core methods at StoryCenter, which is what we call a story circle. And of course, we owe such a huge debt of gratitude to Indigenous communities in the evolution of this method, which really originates in age-old practices and ways of gathering people together to share and listen to stories from their own lives. And so I'm just going to go over some key information about the process as we've adapted it in our work. So first, the Story Circle is a group process that works best with very small, carefully facilitated groups of people. I'd say no more than about 10 people at a time. So particularly in working with very sensitive or trauma stories, it's important not to overwhelm people with too many stories. And then secondly, in terms of just the ability to help people focus in a story circle focused on domestic violence prevention, we've found that it's important to provide clear and concise story prompts so that people really have a framework in which to explore their experiences. And I think, when you think of the fact if you have 10 people in a story circle, it's really not a time for each person to tell their whole life story because you would be there for days and days, right? And so working with story prompts really helps people zero in on a specific story, like the one, for instance, that we just watched at the beginning of the webinar. So along these lines, we really recommend, helping people speak from a position of strength. And so, again, I know that all of you have lots of experience working with trauma, or many of you do, I'm sure, but just to say here that at StoryCenter, we don't actually view story circles as an appropriate intervention with people currently suffering from lots of multiple severe symptoms of post-traumatic stress. So our goal and view is that is to create a safe container where people can kind of delve into their experiences related to domestic violence and then come back out of those experiences rather than staying lost in a spiral of suffering or victimhood. So that's a really important piece there, is being clear about when and with who this process is an appropriate process to work with. And then next, part of how the group process functions is to really build participants, sense that they truly are not alone, that they've in what they've gone through. And so people might be familiar with Judith Herman's work from quite a long time ago, her pioneering work on trauma. And she, in her book, Trauma and Recovery, she did write about how the process of being witnessed by a group of compassionate listeners can be vital to healing and growth for trauma survivors. And so the Story Circle is a great way to work with that. And then finally, the process of the Story Circle that sense of relationship and connection that can be established is really something that we've seen inspire leadership among participants in terms of their interest and willingness to speak publicly and get involved in survivor support or community prevention education efforts, advocacy, and whatnot. So if you're interested in sort of helping to build cadres of community spokespeople, Story Circles is a great way to initiate that kind of process. All right, so let's turn to some specific concrete tips on how best to facilitate a Story Circle. So again, some of these might seem really obvious, particularly if you have experience in doing kind of group process, group therapy kinds of practices, but I just wanted to gather all the how-to material onto one slide. So first, being organized and clear about your project in terms of place and time and logistics is always important. We always suggest allowing at least 2 to 3 hours for a Story Circle with anywhere from 6 to 10 people to make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak. Typically, the way that I facilitate is that depending on how much time and how many people, I divide up the time and leave, 5 minutes of wiggle room between each person, and then I'll say, okay, we have about 10 to 15 minutes for each person to share and receive some feedback, and then we designate a timekeeper and, do our best to kind of stick with that so that all of the participants get a chance, even though it can be tough to move that along. Okay, so next, from an ethical standpoint, it's really critical to prepare your Story Circle participants in advance for what's going to unfold during the Story Circle. And so this means letting them know what kinds of stories will be shared, what kinds of prompts you're working with, what vision you have for how the stories might eventually be published or worked with or incorporated into your outreach or education work, etc. And then how participants will really be supported through the whole process, from bringing them in and any kind of follow-up support that you can offer. And then in terms of ground rules, so I always, maybe this is something that some of you do when you do groups or trainings, I always begin Story Circles by working with participants themselves to surface a set of group agreements or ground rules. People call these all different kinds of things, but basically some guiding principles for how everyone can agree to work with in terms of creating a safe space. So this would include things like mutual respect, confidentiality, self-care, whatever ideas people have for what they need in the space in order to have a good experience there in the Story Circle. And then next, we've already talked a tiny bit about story prompts, and we'll talk a bit more in a slide or two. But in some cases, just to kind of help ease people's anxiety that they might have, you might want to wish to present story prompts at the very beginning and give people either a 10 or 15-minute free writing period, or have them get in pairs and just verbally share for 5 minutes or so a piece, just to help ease maybe some of their nervousness and help them really think into a specific personal story that they might share. And so then when you do the story circle, you can invite people to paraphrase or build on what they might have written down or just shared. And each participant will have their own preference in terms of how they wish to bring their story into the space. You will find that sometimes people do like to write things down in advance, and other people like to really just go for it in the moment there. And then, here, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I had this on the slide. My bad. So we definitely recommend setting out clear parameters for what you're asking people to do. So this would, just as an example, this would include making sure people understand that in the story circle, it's one person talks at a time, so no interruptions, that each person will have a certain amount of time to speak and share, and that keep things flowing. Sometimes we suggest, that this would allow for, maybe a maximum of 3 comments for each person. And so I'll say, we don't have time for everyone in the circle to comment on everyone else's story, and so I'll suggest that people write down their thoughts and comments in writing, and then they can give feedback after the story circle or during a break like that, or if you're having lunch, something like that. And then it can, this is where it's, I think, really important to point out that your role as a facilitator of a story circle process is not one of, you're not there to be sort of the content or editorial expert. Your role is really to guide the process, invite people to speak and share, and encourage conversation and discussion amongst and within the group, rather than to kind of position yourself as the expert leader, something like that. The best story circles work when there's a good conversation and flow of comments and feedback among the participants themselves. So it's very much a collaborative experience and not a top-down kind of educational experience. So you're there to moderate, to keep people to the guidelines, move along with the time, etc. So those are a few tips on methods. And then I wanted to offer just a very simple formula for sharing stories, which might be useful as you work directly with prevention advocates, survivors, etc., in developing stories. And so this is something that you can just, have in mind yourselves, or this is something that you can certainly share with groups that you might lead. But this is what we call the 4 C's, and it can be a really helpful way to frame story content, especially for people who might not have much experience with delving into a personal story and sharing it. So the first C is connection. And so this is all about establishing the relationship. How are you going to do this? What's sort of what's your little introductory spark or hook that's going to engage your listeners in the story? So this might be done through a really poignant detail, some kind of teaser comment. I think in Becca's story, she really begins talking about, not about sexual violence at all. She begins by talking about her love of pottery. And so that's a way of kind of easing us into the story. And, we want to hear more about how she develops that relationship with that art practice. It might be a slightly kind of suspenseful introduction. That piques people's interest but doesn't give away the content of the story. So there's lots of different ways to establish that connection, but the main idea is something that's going to really draw people in. Okay, so the next C, using this framework, is all about context. And so while personal stories shared in a story circle are quite short and anecdotal, it is important to make sure that the story has enough information about what it's about to enable the listeners to make meaning and make sense of it. And so, this is where the perspective of kind of uninformed audience members in the story circle can be really key in terms of filling in missing content. Again, going back to Becca's story that we watched, she does fill in enough detail about the assault she went through without getting too graphic or sort of overdoing it and risking re-traumatizing her audience or turning people off. And she also uses the approach of addressing her perpetrator directly, which was an interesting choice, and I think creates kind of a nice sense of intimacy because it's sort of like we're invited into this conversation and these questions that she has for him. So that's about the context, just in terms of giving enough backstory. And then we come to the idea of change. So often people tell stories to illustrate an experience that has somehow deeply impacted or changed them. And so rather than telling an audience what that change is, we really recommend showing the audience through the use of specific details that zero in on a particular moment or scene. So for instance, Becca doesn't give us some lecture, like finding pottery really changed my life. She actually points to the specific time she encountered a particular piece of pottery and to her engagement with it as something that really helped her grow and move. And she gives us that specific example of that moment of change of finding that art form. And so, obviously this idea of change will look different for every story, but using this to help a story move through a narrative arc can be really helpful. Coming to the next C, which is conclusion or closure, some people will say. So, in our work, we really do try to stay away from this idea of wrapping stories up too neatly and tidily. Just given the open-endedness and the fact that, in many cases, people are still kind of in and moving through the stories that are shaping their lives. And this, at the same time, it can be important, especially with sensitive content, to offer some sense of closure. And so, in the story that we heard and that we watched, Becca does this really simply and powerfully by continuing to talk directly to the perpetrator. In this case, where she makes that statement about she herself determining how she feels about herself rather than believing what that person might think. So she doesn't go on and on sort of telling us about how she's healed and everything is fine. She keeps it very concise and focused. So we're left at least in a place of clarity about where she's ended up in relation to the story. So I always, generally feel like, less is more with this idea of conclusion, and that really more of the power of the story comes in those earlier parts. But there's lots of different ways to do the conclusion. All right. So now we've talked about the idea of working with story prompts, and this being something that can be really helpful to ease people into a story circle process and give them just a clear sense of what it is your storytelling project is all about. And so these are really just some sample prompts that I wrote up for this particular webinar, and I kind of came up with them working from a place of a little bit more vulnerability, to a place of support, to a place of action. And I think all of the three prompts together lend themselves to exploring that one thing concept. But of course, in your work, you'd want to adapt and revise these to fit your context. And you could even say, tell a story about the one thing that you've done to address domestic violence, right? The purpose of the prompts is to help, again, help direct people towards a very specific story rather than talking generally about their lives, their work, their experiences. So think anecdotal stories, again, rather than life histories or, sort of project reports and that kind of thing. And I did also, I wanted to kind of allude to those three levels of experience in terms of vulnerability around a direct experience of violence, experience of being supported, and an experience of action, because really at the end of the day, if you're doing some story circle work in your community and you're inviting people in, you may have a little bit of a sense of what their past experience is, but you're not necessarily going to really know exactly what story is calling to them that needs to be shared in the particular moment and experience of the story circle. And so I think it's important to make space for various different levels of experience and not sort of force one particular angle when people might really, for instance, for them sort of finally be ready to speak out publicly about something that they went through. So, just creating a safe container to work with lots of different levels of experience. So I see a lot of questions, and I'm sorry, I'm just like breezing through the slides, but I do see the questions there, and so we're almost finished. I'm just going to finish with the slides, and then we can go back and work through the questions. Okay, so let's turn now to offering feedback to storytellers. So this can be one of the pieces. I'm not so much concerned about this with this particular audience, because my sense is that anyone who would sign up for this webinar would probably have some specific interest and experience already in working with survivors, community members, etc. But this whole issue of story feedback can be a tricky one to train people on. And so, so at StoryCenter, just from our years of experience, we know that it's super important when you're working with sensitive content in story circles to really follow the storyteller's lead when it comes to offering any kind of input or comments like that. So even if you're framing your project with a prevention focus, as I said, you might find that you'll have people disclosing experiences of violence as well. And so, if somebody is for the first time using her or his own words and voice to describe a situation over which they had no control, only to encounter a so-called helper giving them unsolicited advice about what they're saying, this can be hurtful and, might shut the person down. So in terms of feedback, these are just, I'm just going to bring these all up at once. So these are from some of the most basic elements, basic contents from our facilitator training program at StoryCenter in terms of how we talk with entry-level trainees about responding to stories. And again, I'm sure this kind of thing is really second nature to many of you, but I wanted to just bring these up as examples. And, nonetheless, when you're setting up a story circle, even if you as a facilitator have lots of experience with offering sensitive feedback, it's important to take a moment to set some, guidelines for the group and, request that people tread lightly when it comes to offering feedback in the ways, for example, in the ways that are listed here. So you can suggest beginning with an appreciation for the story, using I statements to really take ownership for your comments rather than like, you should do this and this, and of course, providing validation. So, so again, your job as a facilitator is not one as, authority. Your role is to really help create that safe space and support the storytellers in offering feedback to each other, because they're really the ones who need to be engaged in that dialogue and sharing with one another. All right, so great, we're almost done. We'll have some good time for questions. So before we end, I wanted to just share a quick glimpse of some ways you might approach actually documenting stories shared through the story circle process. Maybe there are some of you on the webinar who have lots of experience with documentation, with developing films and videos, et cetera. Just, take this with a grain of salt. This is very introductory kinds of suggestions and just, trying to present, different levels, I guess, of where you can go with the documentation piece. So I've ranged these from kind of no tech to higher tech, starting with the always available option of doing a story circle as a tech-free experience, which in fact is the way it really needs to be done, meaning you do need to make sure one of your ground rules, if nobody suggests it, is that people need to put their phone, turn it off or put it on silent, no cell phones during that process. That can be very disruptive. But anyway, just doing the story circle as a lived tech-free experience and focusing on the process of sharing and offering support and feedback can be super powerful. And then another option that you have would be to do some follow-up meetings with storytellers after a story circle to audio or video record the story that they told using whatever equipment or smartphone tools you have, or to build in some time for participants themselves to construct stories. Again, if you're interested in that and that kind of participatory production, reach out to me offline and I can give you some consultation on what might be possible there. I would say that for us at Story Circle, we never allow the Story Circle process to be audio recorded or filmed because we feel like it really kind of breaks the sacredness and the safety of that experience. So I definitely would steer away from that because it would really just change the whole dynamic there. And then finally, of course, you can, with a higher tech option, you could hire a freelance person to conduct follow-up interviews and edit material, or work with someone on your staff who has this experience to actually create some edited videos. A lot of your decision-making around this is going to depend on your particular aesthetic preferences and on your sense of what kinds of presentations are going to work best for whatever purposes you have for developing and sharing stories. Some people really prefer the more kind of homemade, anecdotal, survivor-driven aesthetic, such as the one of Becca's story that I shared. Other people prefer, more traditional kind of talking head, mini documentary types of presentations. It really depends on your particular inclinations around that. Okay, so now we do have a little bit more than 10 minutes for questions. So I think what I'll do maybe is just scroll back up in the chat box and try to get through the questions. Oh, okay, so it looks like the questions are pasted over to the side. So there's a few. Yep. Yeah, and then if there's others, people can feel free to type them into the chat box. Okay, so the first question is, what questions, I guess you mean maybe what prompts move us from service needs to prevention needs? That's a great question. To be honest, much of the work that StoryCenter has done has focused probably more on, advocacy for service needs and survivor support, et cetera. For me, I think that the interesting prevention questions are more around, tell a story about a time when you intervened in something that could have gone awry, or tell a story about, a time when you saw something that could have happened, that kind of thing. So getting people to think about and talk about, the role of what roles that bystanders can take, the importance of kind of early warning signs, things like that can focus on prevention. So that's what I would say about that. And I would encourage people to take a crack at developing some questions around prevention and, maybe sharing them out with the entire group. I think that would be a great activity, and I'm happy to help. I didn't do it specifically for this webinar just because, there was sort of a focus on intervention, prevention. And then the other question there is build resilience and self-worth, not just addressing once harm has been experienced. Yeah, related. That's of course, that's a great point there. So I think questions that can really help people articulate experiences when they felt that they were able to act with agency and tap into their resilience and self-worth is great. So tell a story about a time when you when you really stood up for yourself in a situation when you could have been vulnerable, or tell a story about, a moment when you really saw how your own self-worth and decided not to believe what other people think about you, things like that can get at those types of experiences. And then Nicole has a question about young people. So absolutely. So we do quite a bit of work with young people. I would say I have worked with middle school. It's a little bit of a young age for that. I think you'd want to tread pretty lightly with the story circle approach. I think maybe storytelling is great, but with a middle school audience, I would see it being more appropriate to do story writing and kind of story sharing in pairs, because oftentimes young people will feel a little bit put on the spot if they're asked to kind of share something with a larger group, or at the very least to kind of work up to the group sharing with some more structured activities that help people work first on their own and then maybe in pairs and then maybe in groups of 3, that kind of thing. Help them polish a story before they have to share it with a group. And then for that, you know, the trauma-sensitive, trauma-informed approaches would be really key. And we can send out afterwards, but we have some really good resources that I didn't include links to here on ethical practice in storytelling, as well as trauma-informed approaches. So we can send those out to people afterwards to take a look at, but particularly with young people, I think you'd want to pay really close attention to not doing anything that's going to trigger them like that. And then the other thing I was going to say about working with young people is, in my experience, I've really seen that in working with youth, you know, if you look at adolescent development and the whole literature on early, middle, and late adolescence, it's typically the young people who are in the late adolescence category that have more of a capacity to self-reflect and to think critically and kind of analyze their own experience. And so this kind of reflective practice of personal storytelling tends to work better with slightly older youth. You know, so often when we're working with organizations around youth issues, prevention issues, we'll frame it as slightly older youth, but telling stories about things that might have happened when they were slightly younger youth, that kind of thing, rather than diving right into working with the very young-aged young people. But, you know, I mean, the bottom line is that if you're working with young people already, you have a sense of their capacities and what is and isn't appropriate, and so I would really go with that. And then we have a question around working with participants who become overwhelmed and upset. So again, I'm going to share out the trauma-informed storytelling piece. You know, the main answer to that is you do really careful screening in advance of your participants. And if somebody is really in a place of challenge, difficulty, distress, and has never shared their story before, that person would not be a good candidate for the experience of the story circle. Again, we don't see it as a clinical intervention for people who are having lots of active distress, and I think it works much better, particularly from a prevention angle with this, you know, one thing idea. It's going to work a lot better if you do work with survivors or people who've experienced violence, that they have a pretty substantial period of time between when that might have occurred and what they're doing now, and that they've already done some group process work and some activities and whatnot. So the exception to that would be, of course, if you have a clinical person, a counselor, therapist, social worker, and you wanted to, you specifically wanted to work with storytelling as an intervention. But I would view that as a very separate endeavor from, a more community-based kind of prevention advocacy experience. And I say that based on many, many years of experience. And, at StoryCenter, we have very clear screening guidelines that I'm happy to share around how we help assess whether or not people are ready for something like Story Circle or digital storytelling. And those were developed in collaboration with a licensed clinical social worker because we had a couple of experiences where, even with organizations like the ones where you all work, doing the outreach and recruitment for storytellers, we still ended up with people in groups who really should not have been there and who, in fact, took up all my time, because then that becomes very much of a one-on-one situation of, just really listening and being present and helping kind of guide people through that difficult content and find their way out. So that's probably a more long-winded answer than you wanted, but we'll follow up with those resources. Okay, so any other questions? that people might have.
I have a question, Amy. What about, you mentioned that, working with survivors that have, are at a different stage in their journey, not that they've been recently, recently left the abusive relationship, but somebody that has been sharing their story. But what about if their story is still in progress? If, it takes a long time to heal, but they still want to share. Is that okay? There's not, a resolution yet.
Yes. No, that's a great question. I mean, I think, that's really such a case-by-case, one-on-one kind of question. I think that's where it becomes very important for staff to do that kind of screening and assessment to determine readiness. Personally, if it were me, I would, do a separate process around, stories for people who are kind of trying to work through a more present-day experience. I would frame that as a separate activity or process from something that was really framed as, what's the one thing you can do to prevent domestic violence? Because I think the needs of, direct survivors or, people who are really still in some sticky situations is quite different from people who are really mobilized and ready to kind of take action around advocacy and prevention. So that's probably how I would do it. And then, again, just do that, that careful screening. I don't want to patronize and say that, it's, never a good idea. But just to, I would just say, be careful. So for instance, there's a book that we refer people to a lot. It's called Writing as a Way of Healing, How Telling Our Stories Transforms Our Lives. It's a great book. I can send the reference. It's by, I forget who it's by. But even in that book, so she's talking about, writing through difficult life experiences, illness, cancer, etc. And she even has a pretty strong kind of cautionary note in there about, the potential to re-traumatize people if they're too still mired in a situation. Another way of putting it is, if you look at the trauma theory and the work of that trauma expert, that guy Bessel van der Kolk, which maybe people are familiar with. So he talks about like a trauma spiral. And so as an advocate or a support person, your role being to kind of help people spiral into their trauma story as much and as far as they're ready to in that moment, but then to always help them like spiral back out of it. And then the challenge being, if you can't help them come back to a position of strength, then they just really get lost in it. So for instance, I've had that experience, again, in workshops of working with people who are just so deeply in their current crisis that they can't really find any strength or resolution. And then it just becomes not a beneficial experience for that person because it's just re-traumatized, just bringing up again and again how difficult their experience is. And I think the same is true, in fact, when I've read articles about therapeutic approaches, for instance, with veterans. And, some people will say the same thing, like it's not actually effective to immediately expect somebody to just debrief and share everything that they've been through because they don't have the strength and the readiness to be able to do that without getting overwhelmed. So I'm not a therapist, but I am a trained, sexual assault crisis counselor, and I've got lots of experience. So that's all of that is just based on my experience. So other questions? I think we're just about at the end. All right. So I'm going to just go, Yvonne, I'm going to just go to the references if people are interested. Again, please, thank you so much for being on the webinar, and please don't hesitate. If people have more questions or specific scenarios you want me to help you with, please feel free to reach out. My email is on the slide. And Yvonne, are we going to send the slides out to people?
Yes, and Brecken posted it a little while ago. They're going to be receiving an email after our session. It's going to have our survey, and it's going to have the link to where they can access all of the resources here, the PowerPoint presentation, the transcript, even the chat. So, and other resources that we want to put in there. So be on the lookout for that. I also want for everybody to remember that you can access the free and downloadable One Thing Action Guide, and Brecken also posted the link on the chat. So make sure that you access it, download it, and it has great information on how to, adapt the hashtag One Thing messaging into all of your awareness campaigns. So, Amy, anything else?
No, I just was typing in the chat box. I'll send you the link to those 2 resources that I mentioned, and then we'll get all that out to everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
That's a pleasure, like always, Amy. You are wonderful, and you gave us a lot to think about. So everybody else, thank you for joining our session today. I want to thank our NRCDV staff that has been working really hard, and our captioner, Angie, who did an amazing job. Thank you, everyone, and please complete the survey that you're going to receive. That's the information that allows for us at the National Resource Center to, put on great training events for you. So have a great afternoon, and thank you, Amy, and thank you, everybody.